All right, this is Sam Connington. This is my video for the Air Force group. It's like my upteenth time of recording this. It keeps deleting itself, so hopefully this one goes through. For my poem, I picked "Men Who March Away" by Thomas Hardy, and I'm just gonna read the last four stanzas because I think they're probably the best part. Let's jump into it. Nay, we well see what we are doing, though some may not see. Dahlias as they be, England's need are we. Her distress would leave us ruing. Nay, we well see what we are doing, though some may not see. In our hearts of hearts, believing, victory crowns the just, and that braggarts must surely bite the dust. Press we to the field ungrieving, in our hearts, heart of hearts, believing, victory crowns the just. Hence the faith and fire within us, men who march away. Eerie the barn cocks say, night is growing gray, believing all that here can win us, hence the faith and fire within us, men who march away. And that was Thomas Hardy's "The Men Who March Away" again. I'm just going to jump into it. It's me, right here. So on September 2nd, 1914, Charles Masterman, British politician and propagandist, leader during the First World War, called a meeting to the Wellington House in London, which was the home of the British War Propaganda Bureau during World War I. He invited all of the major poets and writers of the day, including the likes of Rudyard Kipling and Thomas Hardy, although Kipling wasn't actually able to make it, so Thomas Hardy, in my opinion, is the most significant writer there, although I don't really know much about the other ones. And at the meeting, he wanted to push positive images of the war by the literary leaders to help further the positive feeling of the war in Great Britain. And this occurred less than a month after Britain had declared war on Germany on August 4th that very year. So after he had called all of those literary people and encouraged them to write positive works, publish them to help further up the morale of the country, on the 9th of that same month, just a week later, Hardy would publish one of his famous poems, Men Who March Away. So Thomas Hardy's previous work, such as Drummer Hodge, which was published in 1899, featured a largely negative view of the British war efforts pertaining to conflicts such as the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, or Channel Firing, another famous poem, which was published in April of 1914, prior to the onset of World War I. And both of those see Hardy's perspective on the war and, well, for the second one, World War I, in very, very different tones, and it's much more negative. Men Who March Away was meant to be read at soldiers marching type rhythm, and well reflected the public perception of a quick and easy war in World War I, which would quickly not be the case as trench warfare quickly proved. For me, it remains a piece of literature, the poem "The Men Who March Away," that is well representative of not just the British Propaganda Bureau, but also Thomas Hardy. Now for some background information on Thomas Hardy himself. He was born in 1840 in southwestern England, and he lived until the year 1928. So he saw the majority of the Victorian era and that age of growth in the intellectual sphere, as well as Darwinian thought, which he fiddled a bit with in his Middle Ages. He lived during a really fundamental period in the development of the modern world as we see it today in an intellectual sense. And for me, that's like the mid to late 1800s to the early 1900s is like a really, really interesting period of history. So it's interesting that he got to live through a decent chunk of that. For me, I think it's fair to say that the piece well reflects the cultural spirit around the going to war, and well reflects what at the start of the Great War many Britons deemed to be a just war. Poetry like this helps to illustrate that societal feeling of war while the spirit is fresh and hope remains high and naive. Now, there's actually a lot of debate amongst historians about whether or not his poem, the poem I just read, titled "The Men Who March Away," about whether or not that poem itself is genuine from like the perspective of Thomas Hardy himself. I don't think there's much debate over whether or not it's a good representation of public perception during the war, because at the onset of it, it was very much viewed as being this patriotic, let's go fight for our cause, especially in Great Britain. But obviously, as the war progressed, the sentiment changed to a degree. How much changed is pretty debatable. But for Thomas Harding, it was interesting because during before the onset of the war, kind of when the skirmishes were just starting and everything was tightening up, he had a very negative perception of it, and he's not been shy to call out the tragedies and the unnecessary brutality of like these wars, such as the Boer War. So he's not really one to not complain about British wars at all. And then actually, as the war progressed in 1915, one of his favorite cousin ended up dying in the war, and that was something that very much changed some of his perceptions. And he would go on to write very negative perceptions and poems about World War One. So it's kind of interesting. Obviously, people can change their minds, so it's not necessarily negative, but obviously has some influence from the government. So that's interesting. I think these kinds of poems are really important. I honestly hate poetry, but in this case, they're really important because they help to kind of capture the sentiment of the public around certain topics of the war. So what's interesting about this one, it had to like almost nothing to do with battle or being there. This is like soldiers leaving the country, which is a pretty important moment in like any war because it's when you're sending off your troops. It's when right off the onset of the war, we're sending our men over there. This is the beginning of it. We all celebrate. It's like very symbolic, and this kind of captures that mood, I think, pretty fairly. So the perspective is definitely really cool. And obviously, it's a really simple poem with, I think it was about six stanzas overall. Yeah, six stanzas. And it's the rhythm, it's meant to be read as a marching soldier type beat. So it's really simple. Obviously, I didn't read it like that because I'm horrible at reading poems, but if someone was good at it, it would sound a lot better. And the mood of it captures the sentiment that they're trying to set really well. So I think it's kind of cool. And hopefully that answers it. It's a bit over time limit. Thank you.